Everyone, welcome back to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I'm the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. I'm also the host. Mostly, we've had the benefit of some great guest hosts lately, but mostly the host of the SERMAPod. We are now well into our 70s, so we're thankful to all of you who have been listening, suggesting topics, viewing. We've got a great topic today, very timely, unfortunately. But very timely nonetheless. We've got an excellent expert in the area of grief and loss in sports, Dina Bell-Laroche, who is a partner with Sport Law. She is a grief doula, leadership coach. She is the former press chief for the Canadian Olympic Committee. She's been to 5 Olympic Games. She's very prolific in the space. She's an author whose latest book is right over your shoulder there, Grief Unleashed. Dina, thank you so much. We're humbled to have you and very grateful to have you on the SERMAPod.
Oh, I'm just delighted to be here. And thank you, Rich, for the amazing work that you're doing to support sport organizations.
So we had a great discussion and booked you for this topic a few weeks ago. Always a very timely topic, one that is, I think, underrepresented. And, of course, our mission with SERMA is to cover topics that are not being covered elsewhere. But, Dina, it became all that more relevant in the last few days, unfortunately, with the very bad news over the weekend, very untimely passing, way too young, of a superstar in the world of sports, in particular in hockey. Columbus Blue Jacket player Johnny Gaudreau and his brother were killed in a tragic drunk driving incident. That's the current charge. We're not, of course, that hasn't been completed yet, but the allegation is that they were victims of a drunk driver who failed to yield to their bicycle, and they were both tragically killed. We saw that followed by an outpouring of grief, expressions of loss for these 2 young athletes who were really in the prime of their, not just careers, but their lives. One was a parent to be, I believe, and Johnny Gaudreau, known as Johnny Hockey, was a parent of a child. Much beloved in Calgary, where he started his career, much beloved in Boston, where he played college hockey, and notably, I believe, scored the winning goal in a national championship game, and then signed a big deal with Columbus, and of course was endeared to those Ohio fans. So in the wake of this tragic loss, Dina, talk to us about how that impacts, not just fans, but players. Again, you deal with an area that is often underserved, underrepresented. We all deal with issues like concussions and CTEs and orthopedic injuries. Those are well-established injuries, but what is not as well covered, perhaps not as well diagnosed and treated, is the injuries to your mind and your heart and your soul. So talk to us about how that Johnny Gaudreau and Matthew Gaudreau tragedy affects those emotions.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I just would encourage anyone who's listening to maybe pause and in a moment of silence for the Gaudreau brothers and their family, who the day before their sister was to be married were out, for a shared experience. And then the unimaginable happens. And that's often the space that I deal in, is the unimaginable. And, on the same day, a young athlete near Ottawa was killed, on her bike as she was riding to her friend's place. And I've been supporting the club over the weekend, so I've been holding, the Gaudreaus in my heart and the extended family, and also this community, in Cornwall, who are all looking for answers. The unimaginable happened, and when that happens, especially when it's what we call out of order deaths. So these out of order deaths are often, when children die or young adults die, or people have been, in this case, there was a tragic car accident. We are left wondering, why did this happen? And, something really important for us to remember, Rich, is we tend to be, death denying as a society, a North American society, and grief illiterate. We don't have the language to talk about what happens to us when life goes sideways. So for your listeners, grief is an individual experience, and it really depends on my attachment to the person. It could be an object, it could be my body, it could be a dream. So we attach, right? And when that attachment is severed, Grief is the natural and involuntary response to that attachment. So then the experience is very individual. And then when we have a situation like this, where there is, it's a public figure, or in the case of the young athlete, the whole community knew this young girl, there's collective grief, and everybody grieves differently. And because we don't talk about this, we tend to impose our way of grieving onto others. And so, something really important for all of us to understand is grief is individual. And then, when we take that grief public, that's called mourning. And so, rituals are so important, which is what I was doing with this young soccer team, is to help them ritualize the experience. So supporting the coaches in coming together as a group, in deciding whether or not the team is going to play on the day of her funeral, how they can commemorate their teammate on the jersey. Maybe there's a healing ritual we can do in advance of the game, because keep in mind, these young teammates of hers are 13 and 14 years old, right? So, really important for us to have this literacy so that we can navigate the complexity of the experience. Too often, though, is we come to this bereavement experience ill equipped, not understanding what happened. So then all of the complications get layered on us because we don't have the language, and then people tend to superimpose their way of coping onto others, and so needless tension can come in, which further exasperates the grief experience. So a lot of the work I do now is education, advocacy, literacy, and then of course grief companioning, where I can walk alongside the bereaved, whether it's a single individual or sometimes it's teams, right, of athletes. Sometimes it's a community where we can hold these rituals to help our hearts heal.
Athletes are different, right? I mean, athletes are raised to be impervious to pain. The culture is such that you play through pain. You're rewarded frequently for playing with injuries, right? I mean, I think we're a little more cognizant of the dangers of that recently, but historically, athletes are taught, if you've got, rub some dirt on it, right? Tape it up, get an injection. If you've got an
Exactly.
injury, play through it. That's what athletes do. Um, and they're held up in our culture and society as heroes who are larger than life. Contrast that culture with the reality of dealing with grief and loss, such as the death of a teammate, especially when it's thrust upon you with no warning. It's one thing, of course, if you're losing someone over time and they finally give in to an illness or an injury. That's painful, of course. But when someone like Johnny Gaudreau dies and they're your teammate and they're literally in the prime of their life, full of joy, full of energy, excitement for an upcoming season, and just like that, they're taken away. How does that impact teammates of his, for example?
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you kind of naming what has been, I'd say, up until now, the dominant way of being in sport, right? A very masculine energy around push through it, get through it, put it behind you, stay focused on the big prize, because that's what really matters. When we talk to athletes, especially the younger ones that are coming in, they are all about authenticity, and they are more in touch with their emotions than I would say most of us north of 50, excluding present company, of course. So because I do so much work with coaches and athletes who are younger, I'm able to speak their love language. And it's really important for us to understand that the muscles that got us to the top of our game may not be the muscles we need to grieve, right? So I'm talking about grief intelligence. We talk about emotional intelligence, but what is our capacity to name the emotion, to allow it to be processed? People often say, Rich, that grief is just an emotion. And I would say there's no just about grief. Grief is an embodied experience, right? It can hurt, like we feel, and there's science behind this, right? You want to know more about this, check out The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor, right? There's an understanding that grief is a biopsychosocial phenomena, meaning it's going to hit all parts of our lives, right? So when someone dies, then we might be reordering our entire belief system. When someone close to us dies, our bodies ache for them because that attachment is still real and true. Our brain might understand that that person has died, but our body doesn't. There's something called, I love acronyms, there's something called a STUG. And a STUG is a sudden temporary upsurge in grief, right? Coined by Therese Rando. A STUG is we could be walking in the mall and 2 years, 3 years, decades after my person has died, I might experience a STUG, a sudden temporary upsurge in grief. Why? Because they're playing that Christmas song that my sister and I used to giggle at when we were young kids. And all of a sudden, I'm back in that 6-year-old body experiencing that moment and remembering that she has died. So when we have this language of grief, when we honor the experience, when athletes, for instance, understand that what's happening to them is grief and it might reorder their world, their bodies might be hurting, their hearts are hurting, their social network is hurting, their moral compass might be compromised. When we normalize all of that, then we can better deal with the risk, the real risk of poor performance, of injury, because grieving people are far more likely to be injured, right? Their immune system is compromised. They're more at risk of blood clots. So if we understand all of this, and then we create what I call bridges, right, towards collective mourning without shaming people into silence, right? The old adage of just move on, put it behind you, that doesn't work. And it never did. But in our penchant to get back to the game, to produce and consume as if the person we loved never existed, doesn't make any sense. So challenging conventional practices, right? These cultures that are obsessed with outcomes, these cultures that reward speed, we need to understand that those cultures are now starting to disintegrate, and being able to face the fact that people we love are going to die is part of us reclaiming our humanity, which is what we need to do, which is why when people like, Johnny Hockey and his brother and this young athlete that I've been supporting her family and friends with, this is us reclaiming what it means to be human, and explains why people will make drastically different decisions after they go through a life-altering event like what we've just, experienced over the weekend.
Aside from the tremendous loss and grief that accompanies the death of a friend, relative, teammate, we're also seeing post-Olympic blues, right? Something you've covered extensively in your career. Again, you've been to 5 Olympic Games. You're the former press officer for the Canadian Olympic Committee. This is something intimately. I was in Paris. It was incredibly exciting. I can only imagine how much more exciting it is for the athletes, whether they are gold medalists, of which Canada got a few, we're proud to say, or someone who didn't medal but participated. But after the Olympics, there's this real phenomena of depression that sets in. Especially, it's particularly seen in the Olympics, because these are not like a professional hockey player or NFL player who are making millions of dollars, who have a temporary off season and then are almost right back at it. Olympians, for the most part, aside from a very small percentage, are going to go back after the games to a life of relative anonymity, and not engaging in very lucrative careers as a result of their athletics, right? I mean, some of them will, but that's a very small percentage. So how do those two factors affect grief and loss in Olympians?
Yeah, and I would say I would add Paralympians as well, because the Paralympics
Yes.
are happening right now. I think you've touched on a really important topic around the particular grief that athletes and coaches face. And we can see that here in the community, right, where you become attached to your coaches, your teammates, the experiences, shared experiences. And when those experiences end, we grieve, but we don't have the language, we don't prepare this, so we just move on. And we stack all these losses after loss. Now, remember, most of the Paralympians and Olympians at this level have been in it for at least 10 years and 10,000 hours. So that's a lot of losses that they've stacked, right? change in teammates, change in coaches. They've probably gone through injuries by the time they play at that elite level. So they know a thing or two about how to compartmentalize, how to stay focused on the prize. And what I would say is it comes at a cost if we don't deal with it. Our grief will find an exit valve, always, right? It finds many ways to try and be expressed. We tend to suppress it. So I would say these post-Olympic blues, these post-Paralympic blues are a real thing, having suffered myself under that. This shared experience where you come together in a bubble with people that have the same passion as you. And then you come home to your real life. And there's the descent, right? The recovery. Even athletes who have experienced their highest peak moment at the games often suffer through. And it's not just the blues, it's actually they fall into a depression. I know I've supported some of them. So I would say the muscles that you relied on to get you to where you are aren't the ones you need now to move through, not get over, but move through this experience of letting go. Because that's what this is. It hurts because we care so deeply. It hurts because we're so passionate about this attachment to our identity, our teammates, the pride of wearing the maple leaf, our coaches, our whole way of being has been socialized for this one moment, right? Or these peak experiences. And nothing, athletes will tell you this, nothing comes close to it until, of course, time has passed and maybe they bear witness to a child coming into the world or they get married, right? But this peak experience that only the elite athletes can ever really kind of have a sense of is not it's not replicable. You and I are stumbling over some of these words because we're it's hard. This is hard conversations. And so it's so important for us to normalize this, put in place measures. And what I would say, Rich, the sad truth is because those of us who are bereavement specialists, I'm a certified thanatologist, we don't tend to see grief and loss as a pathology. Like childbirth, we would say it's a normal, natural human experience. But grief itself is now in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, where all the human ailments, reside. And so therapists and counselors and psychologists, they are not trained necessarily as a matter of their curriculum to understand grief and loss because up until recently, it wasn't in the DSM. But even now that it's in this diagnostic to statistical manual, those of us who are grief and loss informed are cautious with this. Grief is not a diagnosis. It's kind of like saying to a woman, you have a pathology, you're pregnant. So what we would offer is, we need to plan for the fact that grief is going to happen. We need to understand it's an individual experience. And we know that rituals can help us move through the experience in a healthy, integrated way, not trying to replicate the one size fits all. I have some athletes who cry. That's their coping style, right? And then I have other athletes who are more what I would say stoic and tend to not want to talk about it. Both are okay is what we start to share with each other. So if we plan for it, we give people language, we educate, and then we give them resources where they can go and talk to a loss or grief informed practitioner, then we're going to likely see a much healthier transition out of sport into what's next.
Amazing stuff. I want to, before we wrap up, Dina, with maybe a takeaway or some advice you can give to our listeners and viewers on how to deal with loss and grief in sport. Just thinking about the Olympics even further, it's so much, there's so much more wrapped up in that than maybe other sports for lots of different reasons. Number one, frequently success or failure depends not on your own performance, but on the judgment of someone else, right? I mean, a lot of the sports of the Olympics are based on someone else giving you a score. And for someone who relies on their own athletic prowess, that's a very difficult concept to comprehend, right? If you're a baseball player, you've got the power of success or failure in your hands in that bat, right? No one else is sitting there giving you a 9 out of 10 if you strike out. Number one. Number two, you've got the difference between success and failure in many Olympic sports is like literally milliseconds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the difference between, this and this when it comes to a 100-meter dash, or inches or kilometers. So that's also very hard to get your head around, that you've trained maybe your whole life, and your success or failure, whether you're on that medal podium or not, depends on literally, hundreds of seconds. That must be very difficult. Another factor is that your second chance is 4 years down the road, right? Like the baseball player we talked about. If you strike out, guess what? You've got another at bat tomorrow. You've got 162 more games that season to, undo the feeling that you just had. In the Olympics, you've got to wait 4 years. I mean, that's a very, very difficult concept to get your head around. And again, which adds to, I'm sure, a lot of the grief and loss that you see all the time with Olympians.
Yeah, it's a pressure cooker for sure. And I would say, remember, these little beings, right, have grown up in that pressure cooker. That's all they understand. And the people that end up, being elite athletes at that level, they're conditioned to be able to withstand greater and greater pressure. We call that resilience, right? It's not the absence of mistakes or hardships, it's your capacity to move through the experience. And I would say in a healthy way. I would say our system writ large, there's a lot of athletes pushing back because they feel maltreated. They are being maltreated. And those who are decision makers need to catch up. The system has to evolve and become more mature. The system can't rely on, I would say, for the most part in community sport, 98% of community sport is driven by volunteers who are well intentioned, most of them, but ill equipped to deal with the developmental needs of these young minds and bodies who are exiting sport, right, faster than you and I can say, hello. So we need to do a better job, I would say, at community sport, valuing sport as a public asset, making it a privilege right now. That's what it is. I would love to see it as a right. Basic human development, right? Children happy on playing fields, supported by trained adults who understand child development theory, who aren't going to put the pressure on these athletes to perform at any cost. So by the time they mature into an elite athlete, they haven't stacked all of this loss after loss after loss. They have been well treated. And so they are coming into a more mature sport experience healthy, not a version of themselves, and not having suppressed all of these emotions because that's what they've been conditioned to do for the most part. So I think I believe we're in a reclaiming of what sport can do. And that's going to require a seismic shift in our thinking and what we value. And the good news from my perspective, Rich, is that let the children, let the young adults, let the youth lead the way, because this generation, they know what they need. They are emotionally intelligent, and they are gobbling up the stuff that I'm offering when I give them some grief literacy, do the leadership coaching. They want this kind of support. They're not afraid to say, I'm going to talk to my therapist about what's keeping me down, right? So I think we turn to the next generation and say, what can we do to support the next reimagining of the support system? And I'm hopeful that that's happening right now.
Well, I think we covered some great advice. And my last piece of advice in this area, as a former coach for about 15 years to my two kids, is never ask them about the game in the car on the way home, right? I mean, something I've learned the hard way. Never talk about the game. Talk about anything else but the game in that car ride. The book is Grief Unleashed, Moving from the Hole in Our Hearts to Wholehearted. I see it on burnstownpublishing.com. I'm sure it's accessible through your website as well. Dina Bell-Laroche, thank you so much for joining us and covering this really important topic. We really appreciate it. Thanks for all your hard work in this really important area.
It was delightful to spend 21 minutes with you. Thanks so much for the work you're doing, Rich.
Appreciate it.